Hey everyone, Nicole Steckline, Technical Agronomist for DeKalb and Asgrow in Northeast Iowa. It is May 17th and this is the first episode for 2018 and this is the first spring update. So as of today, further to the north, we've still got a fair amount of corn that needs to get put in the ground, most of the beans. When you get south of Highway 3, a fair amount of the crop has been put in, but there's still some corn to put in and the majority of the soybeans. So I want to talk a couple things on corn, a couple things on soybean. The biggest thing on corn right now that I'm seeing is consistency and seeding depth, and that really has been caused by the great soil bed, seed bed that we had prepared. So ground worked up really well this year, and most of our seed got put in a great depth, that 2 to 2.5 inch range. The opposite side of it is if it was really fluffy and we weren't able to set our planters correctly, if there wasn't enough soil on top and most of it was air, as soon as we got that first rain, it settled all the air out of the soil that was above the seed. And now instead of being 2 to 2.5 inches in the ground, now we're looking at that 1 to 1.5 inches. So in those areas, we've got that seed then that is at a little bit more, it's going to have more volatility in both the temperature and the moisture of the seed. So it's going to have more fluctuations and it could have some issues being a viable seedling after that. The second portion of that is residue. So what I've noticed, particularly in spring chiseled fields, is the ground was so fluffy to the point where we couldn't get the trash whips really to move that residue out of the way, and instead it was just kind of pushing it into the furrow. And then with that we put the seed on or in the residue. We had a lot of residue pinning, and there's some plants that are having some trouble growing through that residue and then making it leaf out underground as well. So that's probably the biggest, most prevalent issue that I'm seeing in corn right now, with the majority of it being in that V1 to V2 phase. The other thing that I'm starting to see in corn is ammonia burn. And I know, ammonia burn is mostly correlated with a really dry year, and we have not been dry this spring. Northeast Iowa has been getting hit hard with the rain. However, it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of different things that go into ammonia burn. So the reason that we get ammonia burn to begin with, what's actually doing the burning, is this huge spike in pH at the zone of application. So when we apply ammonia, NH3, that nitrogen, NH3, has to move through the soil to find water, to steal a hydrogen from water and make it go from NH3 to NH4. If we're in typical soil with some moisture in it when we're applying our anhydrous, right at the band where we're applying that anhydrous, it's going to move about 3 inches in every direction to find adequate moisture to go from NH3 to NH4. If we've got drier soils, then it has to move further. But typically, if you're placing that NH3 at that 6 to 8 inches in depth, if it moves 3 to 4 inches, we're far enough away from that seedling where we aren't going to cause burn. However, these places where if it wasn't getting sealed correctly, that anhydrous gas was moving up through the crack and was able to get closer to the surface. The other part of it is, especially in these hills where we've got a lot of end rows, a lot of picking up and putting down of that toolbar, whenever you're picking up and putting it in, there's product going through, and you've got that nitrogen closer to the surface and closer to our seed bed. So these are some seedlings. I was finding some areas, mostly in like some of the end rows and point rows, it's tough to see. So especially if you're in those point rows and you're seeing these small plants and they look like they're water deficient, they're starting to curl up and wilt, it's because they are nitrogen deficient, because those roots have been burnt off. Now these have been out of the ground for a while, but we've got the plant on top. It was looking drought stricken, and especially on this one you can kind of see where these seedling roots, the radicle was burnt off and it's brown, and then any of the seminal roots that were trying to come out were burnt off as well. So just be on the lookout for that. Usually it's not an issue, but with the need to get stuff in the ground and get our nitrogen in, there were some guys that were butting up against that window. So the field where I found these seedlings, the grower waited 5 days before he planted. The problem probably wasn't the timing. The problem was the placing of the nitrogen in some of those end rows where the toolbar was coming up and down, or those side hills if one side of the toolbar wasn't getting far enough into the ground. So let's switch gears quick to soybeans. As I mentioned, further north, there's a fair amount of soybeans that still need to get into the ground. So I want to talk about maturity group and planting population. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll just plant fewer beans because, I don't have to compensate for stand loss because of cool, wet soils, crusting, or beans being taken out by disease and pests, you would be thinking opposite. So in soybeans are source limited. They want as much sunlight as they can get, and that's what's really holding them back from really putting on a lot of yield. So the thing with the soybeans is that we need as many leaves, as much plant matter before we start flowering to help maximize yield. So earlier in the season, if we're planting early, we don't have to put as many seeds in the ground because those plants are going to be able to stretch out because they have more time to grow before we start putting flowers on around June 21st. But the later we plant, the smaller they're going to be, the less leaf area they're going to have by June 21st. So the later we plant, the more seeds we want to put in the ground because we're going to compensate by not having that plant height by having more plants. The other part is maturity group. Now, there's always that cutoff date of when you shouldn't go later, but the later the beans that you plant, the longer maturity that you want to get. And that's because then we'll flower later and we'll give that plant more opportunity to put on more nodes and get more leaf area before we start flowering. Now, we still have to take into consideration to make sure that those beans are going to finish before we get a frost. So that's all I had for you guys today, and if you got any questions, let me know.